Dr. Rivers was, I wanted to know if he had any extra jokes. Is there some way I can turn off the podium light? The various cases that I will show today come from Southern California. Most of them are from Los Angeles, San Bernardino, or Orange counties. Some of you may have seen some of these cases before, and I may be speaking about different aspects of the case than at the talk that you were at before. We will start out with a number of scenes in terms of buried bodies. Buried bodies are generally found when there's an informant who gives us information about an individual that has been killed and buried, or sometimes construction work will bring us into evidence of that type. At this particular site, an informant said that a body was buried in that area. It's very helpful, by the way, when you don't have to search the whole area, but you do know precisely where the body is. At this particular site, this is some ways into the excavation. This excavation took 10 to 12 hours by about 15 people. So if you're involved with excavations where you know there's a body, even if you found it and you're doing it properly, it is going to take a long time to get the evidence. In this case, the torso itself was badly decomposed. The extremities were all skeletonized. And the person you see here is a criminalist who is picking up evidence. In Los Angeles, we have a burial policy. When there's a buried body which involves skeletonized remains, we have a team that includes the criminalist, the anthropologist, the pathologist, as well as the coroner's investigator, the photographer, and sometimes a few other people, and we work in conjunction with the law enforcement agency. We've been doing this for about 4 or 5 years, and I think it's worked out very well. This was an extremely hot day, like over 110. It was one of the hottest days of the year. This was about 4 years ago, and I wondered if I was going to be able to last, because I don't do well in the heat, and I thought, oh well, there'll be 2 pathologists on this, so if something happens, at least I'll have someone to take care of me. Here's one of the pathologists, by the way. This is the excavation of the cranial remains. What we do is use boxes for skeletonized remains. Some people will put them into paper sacks, but generally speaking, at offices, your remains are going to have to be looked at by a number of people. The pathologist, sometimes the dentist, and someone looking at scanning electron microscope, and a variety of other people. So if your evidence goes in and out of paper bags, there will usually be damage. Buried bodies which involve skeletonized remains are very difficult because often the skeletal remains are in a very bad state of decomposition. At this particular location, only the lower part of the skull and one side was present. Had I not been there, if I'd been in the lab and someone had brought this evidence into me, I probably would have said something nasty like, where's the rest of it? Or you didn't really do a good job, or how long did it take you on this one? But since I was there, I realized that's all of the evidence. Sometimes a careful excavation will give you important information on what wasn't there as well as what was there. In this case, the informant had said he had blown the guy's head off, blown his arms off or hands off, and taken his legs and jammed him into an undersized grave, something of that type. And in fact, the evidence that was excavated does support the informant's story. The top of the head was just not down there. And the knee region, you see this injury right above it in an area of a very robust bone. One of the values of having the anthropologist do the excavation is when you have remains such as this with a variety of parts, you will have a trained person who does know the morphology, the shape and structure of the bone. And the hand area also supports the informant's story. In another case, we have in the metropolitan area, under a home, a crawl space, the termite inspector went down there when the house was in escrow and ran into some shoes. He took one of the shoes off and there were bones inside, and I was told that he left suddenly. We're never sure where the bodies will turn up, but it's often in very interesting places. But not if you have to excavate them. This was difficult. Here I am, and here's the coroner's investigator, Phil Campbell, and we are in process of excavating this individual under the floorboards. In this particular case, the skeletal remains were in excellent condition, although they had been buried 20 years. It all depends on the type of soil, what your bone is going to be like. So if you know an individual has been buried 10 years, they may or may not be in good shape. They can be crumbling or very durable. One of the more important aspects of the excavation was to allow exposure of the various cultural items, the ropes, the bindings, so that the pathologist would be able to examine that evidence as it lay with the skeletal remains. The pathologist really should have been at the scene here. The office policy says the pathologist should have been, and it was a missed call. And then I was, informed, well, you should have called back to the office, and then we would have sent one. And so now if I'm at a scene where there is a buried skeletal remains, I will call into the office. If the pathologist isn't there, they will send it out, the person out. Hair often will be present even after a long period of time. When we excavated this individual, we did not know how long the person had been under the house. Here is the cloth around the neck. The rope, by the way, had been placed underneath the leg and had been used evidently to pull the person under the house. One of the values of having the anthropologist at the scene is if there are the homicide investigators there, the anthropologist can discuss various aspects of the case directly. For example, you could see this was an adolescent from the bones because the epiphyses have not united, growth was still taking place. And children are often very hard to identify because we may not have medical records or dental records on them. Sometimes the wormian bones or the sutural bones on the skull can be used for ID if you have an x-ray of the person prior to death. So I was explaining this to the homicide investigators. And also, unfortunately, I was not here this morning to hear the talk by Dr. Bale, and he may have talked about smiling pictures at that time. Hopefully he hasn't talked about any of the cases I'm bringing up, but if he has, someone just tell me and then I'll go on to the next case. In this case, this is what the skull looked like after excavation. Oh, by the way, in the lab you can see the bony segments are still separate. This is half of the pelvis. So instead of 206 bones you're dealing with and trying to bring back, you may have 300, 350. Here is a very protuberant canine tooth, so I said to the investigators, look for smiling pictures if you have a hard time getting records on your possible decedents. Later on, a smiling picture was brought in, however, the individual still had his baby teeth, so this did not help. And later on, it was discovered that this was, I believe, a 13 or 14-year-old boy who was found underneath the house. He'd been buried there. He lived in the house, and everyone in the house thought he was just missing, but instead he was under the house. And it's been asked, well, how could anyone live over a dead body? But I was told they raised poodles, and so maybe the extra smell of the body was not all that much greater than the poodles. The burial case in which we really lucked out, I was very naive at this time, it must have been about 6 years ago, in terms of the buried body approach. And I soon learned that informants aren't always right. Where you think the body is, it may not be. And now when anyone talks to me about a buried body, my first question is, have you got the bones yet? This particular ranch in Los Angeles County, there were rumors that, well, it was a horse stall, actually, there were rumors that Tony was buried in this area. Tony being the owner, he'd been gone a couple of years, and the rumor had it amongst the people who still at the area that he may have been buried in the horse stall. One rumor had it that he had an ear-to-ear grin, and another that he'd been beaten at the head. So I was called and asked, can you help us find Tony? And I said, well, sure, if he's in the horse stall, I will just bring the archaeological unit with the archaeologists and we will excavate the horse stall. That's unreasonable to me. I'm from Kansas, and I did not understand that horse stalls in Los Angeles area were a lot bigger than the ones I had seen. This horse stall had 4 fairly large rooms, and we had 1 van and 10 students. And also I was told later that the rumor was Tony was 6 feet under. That's a lot of hand digging. Well, we started. I had also told the archaeologists that there would be no bad smells because Tony had supposedly been dead about 3 years. I figured he would be pretty well decomposed by that time. What I didn't count on was that these people buried all of their animals back there. Here's a horse buried only 1 year, and it stunk so much the whole neighborhood knew right away that something was happening. Here's one of the students who wasn't at all happy. At that time we brought in the backhoe. The backhoe's been used successfully a number of times in the county. Of course, you can ruin your evidence, but in a situation where you're not likely to find the body without it, we have used it. And in this case, we, using the backhoe, excavated the first stall to the depth of 6 feet, found nothing, and a lot of dead animals around in plastic bags. That's another good use for your anthropologist can check and be sure whether they're human or non-human. This isn't always the most pleasant thing. The backhoe operator was enjoying himself as he raised down this structure, which was necessary in order to excavate. You've always got to have a lot of eyes on the scene because the bones do not come out nice and white as in the laboratories. They will be the same color as the dirt. Well, as I said, we did luck out on this particular situation. In stall number 2, we ran into the body at a depth of 6 feet, by the way. String and a pelvic bone came out, and immediately we stopped the backhoe and went to hand digging, figured out where the grave was, where the body was positioned, and we decided it would be best to go straight for the skull because we would get the dental evidence, and that's where the story was that death had occurred. Also, although we started early in the morning, by this time it was like 4 in the afternoon, and so we had to carry on this excavation under light into the evening, which is not advisable. Here is the dental evidence. The white is lime which had been thrown into the grave site. Another reason that the anthropologist should be the one to excavate skeletal remains is because they will have the skill needed to remove the bones in a condition without damage. Here is the skull, and Tony was bashed in the side of the head. If you had workers who were using shovels in the area, or if someone had decided to shovel out that head to take back to the lab, it probably would have totally collapsed. But by easily removing the dirt around the skull in a very long process, taking several hours, you could simply lift the skull out. Here's another view. The little bones had fallen into the head by then, but Tony's head came out in very good shape. And there was plenty of dental evidence there. You don't always find the body. In Watts, there was a case where an informant who was deemed to be very reliable, a young adolescent boy, had been brutally attacked by his neighbor sexually and then drug under the car to kill him, and he survived, and he told the story of how the neighbor had said, cooperate or I'm going to kill you just like I did your brother and bury you in the backyard with all the other boys. Well, Watts Juvenile Division was not too happy about this story. This is about the same time as the Gacy case, and it was decided that this backyard should have a thorough investigation. The first step here was to pile up the trash so we could find the ground. And this excavation took place with hand shoveling underneath the house where bodies often are found. And the backhoe was used again to excavate every inch of the backyard. And we found nothing. There was still a need for an anthropologist to be at the site, however, because the whole backyard was full of bone. In this case, garbage bone. I had it since analyzed, and it's, pork chops, beef, chicken, rabbit, a little bit of everything. This is Bullet, the dog. Let's see. Here's Bullet, the dog, who now resides in my garage. I've become interested in getting a comparative collection of animals so that I can do more ID. And so I've been collecting all animals that I can find, and a lot of people are donating things to me. So I've got about a half a garage full. When I went up to see my parents in South Dakota, we went out for lunch and to some of their friends who lived in the woods, and I said after lunch, "You don't happen to have any animal bones around here?" And they said, "Well, a deer did come into the woods and died last winter." And I said, "Well, could I see it after lunch, And they said, "Sure." They took me out there, and it was a beautiful comparative skeleton, so I mailed it back to myself, UPS, for $5.43. So it worked out fine. At this particular site in Watts, also, there was numerous clothing elements which interfered with the excavation. It took 3 days and $17,000, we figured, to do this when you include the patrol cars needed to secure the area and various other expenses. Anthropologists can also be of value for on-ground remains. Here in the northern part of Los Angeles County, there's a road going up here. A body had evidently been thrown down, probably at night, thinking that the body was somewhere in this area. Probably it was thrown at night, and the killer did not realize that a lady lived right below it. It looked like kind of a remote area, but he threw it in her backyard. And she had 3 dogs that, like Dr. Rivers was saying, his dog's always bringing things back. So did hers. In fact, she collected all the bones continuously. And when the dogs brought in the skull, the human skull, she realized there was a problem. She reported it and did say that the dogs had been smelling very bad for a number of weeks. The dogs ate up the better portion of this skeleton. If you look at these are the pelvic bones. Very little left. This is all dog activity. The dogs not only ate up the lady, but they buried the bones. And this made a very difficult problem. This was all before I got on the scene, but the canine search dogs were brought out to find the bones that the domestic dogs had buried. Well, after hearing this, I was working on basic ID of this lady in the lab. I said, this would be a great task to see if my bone searchers, FAR, Forensic Anthropological Recovery, if they could do a better job. Could the archaeologists and anthropologists who commonly search with me on these cases, could they find more bones than the trained canine dogs? It would be sort of like a experimental test. And so we went out there for that reason. Oh, these, by the way, are the dogs. And this is the evidence we found. This was the third search, even after trained canines. I think that we did a fairly good job of bringing in more evidence. Often, the group that I go out with is not first on the scene because many of them are full-time employed, and it takes a week or two to actually get my group together. We'll go out second or third, but we almost always find more remains. One of the questions is, too, of what value is going out there and finding more remains. Is this some kind of a scavenger hunt, or don't you have anything better to do? But there are some reasons for doing this. You may find more material that will help with the analysis of the trauma, or in some cases, if the body's not ID'd yet, you might find evidence of that type. Also, you're clearing the ground of further problem, preventing small kids from finding the teeth, trading them for marbles. They'll come into the biology class, eventually end up back in the coroner's office. So we're cleaning the environment of new cases. Here we see a scene where an informant had brought to the attention of the law enforcement officer someone that had been killed and left here several years ago. And they went out, and sure enough, there was a skeleton. So when I got to the scene, I was told this is a male in his 20s and who had killed him, and the whole story. Here's the scene, very heavy in poison oak, which is one of the biggest dangers in terms of searching for bones. Poison oak is, I think, about a fourth or a third of the sites that I search. Some people are really sensitive to it, and they have to watch out. Here's the skull of the individual. When I looked at the victim, I realized, well, this is not a young male in his 20s at all. It's a female. So it may be, the informant had brought them to the wrong place. Maybe there's another skeleton right around the corner. So if you have your anthropologist at the scene, they will be able to supply information on basic ID, which may help in the search. And this comes at the time. You won't have to wait several days for the body to come up for autopsy. Here we have the remains of our female. And by the pelvic area, the pubic area alone, you can get the sex with 99% accuracy in adults if you know what you're doing. So this is not a case where you would wonder if the biological evidence was right or the informant. The biology indicates this is a female. Here's another area of a search by the students and myself. These are students at Cal State Fullerton. Here a body had been thrown off this area, very close to the road. The first search I was not at, but the remains that came in, this skull. These bones came in, but with the animal bones. They were human, though, and this is a problem that is often dealt with. When you have damaged bones, or sometimes children's bones, the people at the scene who may be able to recognize adult bones may not spot these. Here we have two femoral shafts and part of the ilium with the sciatic notch. Here are the searchers. We set out to go back for a variety of reasons. Here's Ron Baker, an enthusiastic searcher. Oh, dear me, this slide. Oh. Now, if someone was walking along this route, they might not see this bone. It blends in well with the countryside. From this direction, they probably would. For this reason, we do not believe in the straight line approach. We meander around with three-pronged gardening tools, on our hands and knees under trees, going through coyote nests, etc. And we try and have several people cross-cutting each other on all areas. This may be one of the reasons we find a lot, even after the second and third time around. This is the third search in this area. This is the first time we're here, and we're the first to spot this mandible. It does go with the skull that was brought in. Here is the evidence we found at the third search. Hair had not come in before, and a lot of times people who are searching for bone are not searching for hair. The hair can be very valuable when you're trying to do a basic identification. For example, I believe that this female, this probable female, was Mexican-American or Oriental, and the hair did help in that analysis. She's still unidentified. This is not her. I'm talking about the first skull. A year later, this lady was thrown the very same point in the road. A female, again, probably Oriental or Mexican-American. And at this point in time, I said, to everyone at that search, I wonder if there's going to be another one. Is this just a random toss, or is someone frequenting this curve? So we are going to go out this fall and take a look around. Here we have the second female, which was not there at the first time of the search for the younger Oriental or Mexican American. one area that anthropologists can probably do more on than they've done in the past, that of serial homicides. Now we're realizing that it's important not to just take each case in and of itself, but to look at patterns where the skeletonized and badly decomposed bodies are being thrown. Which geographical areas, how many are coming in, and are they of the same basic description? If we're working with a serial killing like the Hillside Strangler, the bodies are in full view, and the public begins to be aware of this very quickly with the aid of the press. But in terms of skeletonized remains, which may be thrown or tossed in remote areas, which may be found at a variety of times, they may not even be recognized for the correct sex or age if they're not well studied, then it's possible that a serial killer could go through 30 or 40 bodies and no one would even realize it. So the anthropologist does have a responsibility, I think, when they cover a wide area like myself, to take some note of the patterning of the cases. Right now in Southern California, we're seeing a lot of young females that are unidentified. And in prior times, I've been working these counties now for like 19 years. In former times, they were young males. Now that we've got the Randy Kraft trial, we know why some of them were coming in, because they were associated with that particular line. This case was from Griffith Park, and it's probably one of the strangest cases I've been involved with, still unsolved. It's kind of intriguing. By the way, if anyone can help me on some of these unsolved cases, please let me know. An older gentleman who frequented Griffith Park came across a makeshift gravestone, and he reported this. The coroner went out there. Here is the makeshift concrete marker. And here's a closer view. In the lab, cleaned up. Remains of an unfortunate prospector, name unknown. May he rest in peace. 1983. Well, that's intriguing. So we, of course, pulled up the makeshift concrete marker, which had been well covered with vegetation. Underneath, there was a plastic bag with the skeletonized remains. This is a lab scene later on, with the skeletonized remains of 2 young males. I don't know where the old prospector went, but here we had one male was, say, 15 to 19, and the other in his early 20s. The bones are very dry. They have no odor, so it is impossible to know if this is a recent case. Does it demand further forensic investigation? If there's any odor at all about the bones, you will know, yes, it is recent. You may not know if it's 6 months or 2 years, but you know it's recent enough. These were completely dry. It did appear to be a secondary burial, with these bones having been brought from another locality. There was one skull, which could have belonged with either of the 2 young men, or it could have been a third. So here's a situation where the sorting of bones, which are commingled, will be of aid at the scene. This individual appears to be Caucasoid. The nasal bones are very projecting. The nasal aperture is fairly narrow, and there is a prominent nasal sill. The facial profile is straight. And it's an unsolved case. No dental work done and no attrition of note. Okay. Is someone who's controlling the program, how are we doing for time?
You've got plenty of time.
Okay. Well, whoever's doing that, Rich, are you doing it? Will you just tell me 5 minutes before I should end? Well, what we did on this case, we sent some of the skeletal material to the University of California Riverside Radiocarbon Lab, because Dr. Taylor, who works there, has devised a modification of the radiocarbon technique, which is useful in the separation of recent from ancient remains. And if an individual lived and died in the 1960s, his bones will actually show this because of the nuclear testing that occurred at that time. And so what Dr. Taylor does is he picks up on items that are not dealt with traditionally in the radiocarbon studies, which are used for items of greater antiquity. According to Dr. Taylor, these individuals lived and died within the last 10 years, so it is a forensic case that warrants further investigation. Skeletonized cases sometimes will be solved many years after the remains are found. One of my cases right now that is involved with the Randy Kraft case was brought to me in 1975. So especially for skeletonized cases where it may take a while to find out the identity, they may be of importance many years after the individual died. Here we have a scene from Angeles National Forest. A hiker found a skull in this area, brought it to the coroner, and we were asked to go out there, the forensic anthropological recovery team. These students, by the way, some of them have gone back to school at a later date. They range in age from 20 to probably 55. What they have in common is they do well in the wilds, have archaeological skills, and they know human bone from animal bone, and they're interested in getting out and volunteering their time in this way. To them it's interesting because it's different than their general archaeological field recovery. For a group like this, it was easy for them to see in this area that here all of these bones are animal because they can recognize readily human versus animal. They spotted immediately the 5 mid-shafts, which were human. Searchers who were not trained in osteology would not be able to separate at the scene the human from the non-human because many of the distinctive parts are the ends of the bone. But here we see this is a tibia, a humerus, a fibula, a radius, and an ulna. So having trained searchers who know the skeletal remains may be very useful if the area is heavily laden with animal bones. So I got into this activity of talking to search and rescue and parks and recreation people on human versus non-human bone because there are so many bones being found all over California. Some of the key points, see, it's real hard to teach other people how to do this. If you're an anthropologist, if you've worked many years with human remains, you will pick it up immediately because you're putting together pieces of archaeological remains, and you will learn every bit of the skeleton one way or the other. If you're trying to train someone who doesn't know the bones that well, it is difficult, but here's a few key features. Our pelvis is basin-shaped, whereas other animals have a long, straight blade. We are the only species that has this sciatic notch, so that's very useful, especially because often it will remain, even if animals are gnawing around. By the way, the pubic area here is the extremely important area for sex identification and gives some information on age. Only humans have a mastoid process behind the ear, and this is a very durable, hard part of the body too, so it will often be there when you just have cranial fragments. The location of the orbits is close together, and you would get confused with anthropoid apes or monkeys, but we rarely have those out in the countryside. So in terms of the other mammalian species, this is helpful. One of the biggest difficulties is with the recognition of children's bones. Here we have 2 bones the same length. This one happens to be non-human. This one is a child's femur. I explained to the searchers a key thing when you've got a long bone is to determine if it is that of an adult or a child, and you can do this by looking at the ends. Here is the end of the bone showing the pits, or I call them the nubbies, where you can see that the epiphysis will attach. And so someone who looks at a long bone with this type of an end will know this individual is still growing. So knowing this helps you assess the size of the individual, and you can rule out some bones as being human on size alone. Whereas the end of this animal bone does show complete attachment, so the individual is an adult. So there are some things that you can teach people who go out and routinely find skeletonized remains, but I suspect that many children's bones will still be overlooked by non-specialists. We've talked about the pelvis several times. This slide is just to re-emphasize the key importance of the pubic symphysis and the pubic bones. In this particular case, which has been out for quite a long time, it would appear by the deep cracking of the bones. Many people would take a look at this anomaly and say it was female because the sciatic notch was fairly broad. That would be a misdiagnosis, but it could happen. But looking more at the remains, one would say, hey, where's the pubic area? It's gone. But looking more closely with the remains that were brought in. A fragment fit right there. So the searchers had brought in a very key element, probably not even realizing it. Not only did it give you the correct assessment as male, but the end of this fragment has deep ridges and grooves, which is indicative of a person, say, 22 to 26 years of age. So there's a lot of information on the bones if you know the right ones to bring in. I noticed explosions are coming up after the coffee break. Some of you may have heard about that explosion in Rialto where a man blew himself up with 8.5 tons of black powder. If you heard about it, you probably thought it was a misprint, the tons. But I looked at the remains in the coroner's office, and I asked to go to the scene. That's one of the few times I said, hey, I really want to go out to the scene, even though you say you brought everything in. I'd like to see it. So I went out, and here's the area. I looked around because I was interested, is there any dental out there? They did not have any dental in the office. They had a few bits and fragments of bone. I couldn't find any dental either. There was just so much disruption that it was very difficult to find much. I was brought in because it appeared to the pathologist on the case that there might be more than one person there. The heads of the femur and humeri often will last, even such a heavy explosion as this. They are embedded in fleshed areas, especially in the thigh. And there were 3 of them, but actually there were only 2 humeral heads and a femoral head, or the other way around. So it was consistent with one individual. The question posed to me was, well, aren't the humeral heads smaller than the femoral heads? But in reality, in modern people, they're almost always just about the same size. This was a very robust man with a maximum diameter going up to 53. This was consistent with the description of the man who had called home to his wife and said he was going to blow himself up in this manner. So there was nothing to suggest that this was someone else or that there was another person involved. I was amazed. There was even a pubic bone that lasted through this explosion. Here's part of a pubic bone, which also established that this was a male, the very fragmentary remains that we were looking at. And due to the pattern, in close to his mid-20s, which the decedent was known to be. So with even very bits and pieces of bone, you may have a good description. But of course, this stuff has to be brought in. Someone has to be searching and realizing that small bits and pieces are valuable. A few more pieces there. At the Cerritos air crash, also the anthropologist played a role. And many people do not think of anthropologists when it comes to burned areas, but you do need archaeological techniques when you are sifting through the burned and charred remains of individuals throughout homes that have burned and have layer upon layer. So I went out on 2 occasions. The team of students went out on one. This is the day of demolition. We were out there all day, and we found a lot of human remains during the demolition because as the buildings were torn down, you could find key places like at the foundation where the body parts had hit the homes and come right down, embedding themselves a foot or so into the ground. Some of these remains were not of particular utility, but some of them were dental and did help with additional individuals. What I didn't know at the time was that this is not your picnic scene. I didn't warn my students that they needed to be fully dressed. We were not wearing masks. After this occasion, I did become knowledgeable, or at least more knowledgeable, about searching areas where there has been fire. You do need to protect yourself. You're going to get fumes. Anytime plastics have been burned, we were probably the first to uproot some of these areas because we again had our 3-pronged tools rooting around the refuge, and at an earlier occasion I got extremely sick from being out there with what I was told was some classic kind of chemical pollution. Just an example of dental evidence found at the scene. Also, I worked on the bodies that had been brought in at an earlier date, and again we see the value of the pubic bone even on badly charred and broken up bodies. Here is a female. You can tell the bone is very wide. This is the inside portion. And even though the bone is badly damaged, this is the characteristic pattern of the young occurring up to 24. So I identified this as a female from 18 through 23 years of age, and this was one of the stewardesses. Anthropologists can help in the sorting where you have many, many bodies, such as an airplane crash. They can help at the scene and back in the lab. So we've been doing some research in Los Angeles since 1976 with a very large documented collection of pubic bones, some medial clavicles, anterior iliac crests, sternal ribbons, etc. And we are trying to establish new standards for modern populations. Here are the pubic bone models which we show. So we are using these now, and they are more appropriate for cases today than the old standards that appear in your classic anatomical textbooks. These samples that we have are extremely large. For example, we have 739 documented males in the male series, 500 in the female. For the females, we know exactly how many kids they had and when, so we have a lot of information. The cases which are now giving me great interest, the cases which now are interesting me are these remains that still have some flesh on them. This case, I went to the scene on this case and estimated that this was a female, an adult female at the scene, but I did not say anything more about the age. This kind of a case should really be cleaned, and so now we're doing that. After cleaning, you could see nicks on the ribs, and you could see that this wasn't a female adult in her 20s. I mean, she was 15 to 19, so I lowered her age considerably because I could see much more bony detail. Here, for example, is the bare beginnings of a precursor ventral arc. There's a ton of material, if you know what to look for, on the skeletal remains, and the sacrum has not yet united. So now, furthermore, on this particular case, we have all of this breakage or fracturing of the forearm bones, which I've seen on cases throughout Southern California, and we are wondering what is causing this. I've sent some of the specimens to the Smithsonian Institution, and they've commented. In Orange County started me out on the cleaning process by buying me this stainless steel pot, and then I brought it up to LA and showed them the pot in LA, and they said, great, well, we'll get you one too. And they bought two of them, in fact, so I could do two bodies at once. So this is what we do to clean our bones, and I have to admit that everyone thinks this is a little weird, and they crack a lot of jokes. This is James Taylor, who set up the process, and one of the technicians who helps with the cleaning. We use the portable gourmet stove. Two of them underneath. We can do it very rapidly, so we are learning more about the cause of death on these cases. And the old style, a small pot, is not doing it because we can't clean enough of the body to get enough information. Also in the past, I sometimes did this in my backyard at the barbecue, and I decided to move the whole process to the office. I'll end with a couple of cases on facial reconstruction. I usually don't go for this technique because in California it has not been found to be particularly effective, probably because of the transient nature of many victims. But in this Orange County case, we decided to try it because she had a chipped tooth. This is the case, in fact, where she was found to be 15 to 19 years of age. We knew she had blonde hair because of the blonde hair found at the crime scene. She is not identified yet, but this reproduction did produce many leads. Shannon, the artist, has recently gotten a make on her last one, however, and this I think is really good. We're trying to see if she can do this again. Here's her reconstruction, and here is the decedent. Shannon made this reproduction, and it went out in, I think, 400 or 500 flyers throughout Nevada and California. 5 calls came in, and one of them was the decedent. So this case was identified solely on the basis of the facial reconstruction, in which the clay is set over the skull with scientific information on the skin depth, thickness, etc. So hopefully I have gotten into a number of areas of how the anthropologist can be involved with the evidence. Thank you.
By the way, if anyone is interested in this wonderful cast we're making out of the research, come and see me later on, because our idea is we're actually, making these casts which we sell at the cost of the expense. So I feel kind of funny doing this, like I'm selling fuller brushes or something. But I'm not making any money from this, so I think it's appropriate. So if any of you are interested in the skeletal age or sex research, come and see me. Does anyone have any questions?
Well, wait a minute. I have one question. Judy, do you know how to make an instant skeleton? You put a leper in a wind tunnel.
We'll take our afternoon break, and it's scheduled to start again at 2:30, but we'll start about 2:35, but try to start moving back in here about 2:30.
It is 2:30.
Oh, wait a minute. 3 hours behind here. We're going to start back up about 5 minutes after 3. How's that?
I'm at ATF. I did over 400 bombing and explosives cases. That's drawn from the 15 western states from Texas to Alaska. I was also a member of the National Response Team, which meant that if there was something big that blew up or burned down and they needed a lot of help to go out to one of those scenes, I was one of the chemists who responded. The ATF as an agency investigates something over 600 explosion or explosive cases, related cases, each and every year. So they get a lot of practice. And one of the things that I very quickly learned was that some of the things that we did in the general crime laboratory and the general crime scene investigation work were applicable. Most of them were applicable. But the subject matter was a little different. The application was a little different. For those of you who love jigsaw puzzle parts of crime scene reconstruction, get into explosives work. It'll be the time of your life, because that's all explosives-related cases are. Is an elaborate three-dimensional, in fact, actually four-dimensional, case of jigsaw fitting the evidence back together again. What I'd like to do today is share with you two cases that highlight a number of the requirements, the necessities for successful investigation of explosion scenes. If I could have the first slide. Magic. Look at that. Bombing investigations, as I said, are in many respects just like an elaborate kind of any other kind of crime scene. They are especially difficult, of course, when they involve death and injuries, as a number of these do. You'll probably recognize, in fact, the subject matter of one of the cases that I'm going to discuss, because it's now the subject of not one but 3 books that are out, 2 of which I'm familiar with, Salamander and the Mormon Murders, and looking forward to having a chance to reading all 3 of them and seeing how they treat this particular case. But it was an interesting case because it highlights the role that the laboratory plays, the role that the crime scene examiner plays, and the role that the investigating officer plays. So if I can, we'll start there. October 1985, Salt Lake City. Businessman Steve Christensen goes to his office, sees a package lying outside his office door, opens his office door, reaches inside, sets down his briefcase, and bends over to pick up the box. It's addressed to him. That's the last thing Mr. Christensen ever does. The brown paper wrappings that you see on his chest are not part of the device. They're part of the paper bag of soft drinks that he was carrying. You'll notice massive damage to the chest and leg area. There is considerable damage also to the door frame in this area. As I said, massive wound here and massive leg injuries there. Everything you see at an explosion scene is potential evidence because there are several major things that you're going to be interested in. You want to recover, and I remember them as the 3 R's. You want to recover the evidence, you want to retrace its trajectory or its origin, and you want to reassemble what that explosive incident was. Now, it may be an accidental incident, it may be a criminal assault. But one way or another, you want to be able to do those 3 things. Recover the evidence, retrace where they came from, and reassemble them. So the things that you see right here, the nature of the wounds, the location of damage, the location of wounds, is all very important evidence right from the outset. Documentation is extremely important. You secure the scene, you establish a perimeter around it, and nobody goes into it unless they absolutely have to. There are too many occasions where an investigator or police officer has walked through a scene and walked right back out again with a piece of critical evidence embedded in a heel. At a bomb scene, you can't dance around the evidence like you can at a blood-stained homicide scene where you can see the evidence and very careful tiptoeing around the evidence. It doesn't work that way with bombings. Any little shard of glass, piece of metal, piece of fabric may be critical evidence. You cannot risk losing any of it. So you establish a perimeter. You go in and you search methodically. In this case, they divided the hallway off in grids and searched, and each one of these little flags represents a piece of debris from the scene, from the victim, or from the device. And those 3 elements I remember as the 3 C's: container, concealment, and connections. The container, what was the device built into? Was it a low explosive that required a container to build up explosive force? In many cases there may not be one. Concealment, was it hidden in something else? Do we have pieces of that we have to come up with? And finally, connections, how was it all put together? So we start by methodically documenting all of the physical evidence at the scene. This is the piece of fragment that was recovered from Christensen's chest. It is a 12-inch long segment, the entire length of a piece of 2-inch pipe nipple, galvanized pipe. On the outside of the pipe, you can't really see it very well in this photograph, are remnants of tape and the stamped impressions of concrete nails. This device, as you'll see in a moment, was wrapped with layers of tape and concrete nails. Why? Shrapnel. This increases the chance that you're going to kill the person that you're aiming this device at. So when somebody says, well, I just wanted to scare somebody, right, that's why you put all the shrapnel on. You scare the daylights out of it for about a 30th of a second. This is the lower torso x-ray of Christensen. Here are 2 of the concrete nails. These are fragments of pipe scattered throughout the body. Notice some of the tiny fragments of wire, like here and here, down here, here. One of those was the stem wire of a mercury tilt switch with a little mercury stain on one end. That was our proof that we were dealing with a tilt switch booby-trap device. Once again, that goes against the intent. You don't build a tilt switch device that somebody has to pick up and physically manipulate to trigger if you just want to scare them, you just want to do damage. This is a device intended to kill. The patterning of injuries on the outside, on the soft tissues. Here is a concrete nail still embedded in the tissue. Here is the edge-on view of a nail that's hit the tissue and bounced back out again. So the pathologist's findings in cases like this are absolutely critical. And the medical team has to work very closely with the detectives and the laboratory afterwards. This is a particularly interesting x-ray. Notice the concrete nails embedded in the leg. This is a piece of pipe. Notice also the location and direction of the damage to the leg. The blast was centered out here, almost at floor level, and went that way towards the back of his leg. That helps us establish the fact that the device was still down at the floor and he had just started to straighten up or started to move it off the floor when it triggered. So this helps reconstruct. As Dr. Rivers mentioned, finding somebody with expertise in explosive-related injuries is very difficult. The medical people associated with the armed forces can sometimes help, but the general forensic pathologist will not have seen this sort of damage very often. You have to be very careful. 1 hour later, Kathy Sheets, wife of businessman Gary Sheets, walked back to the front of her house, noticed a package addressed to her husband lying on the front porch or on the front driveway. She had just been out for a walk with a friend, had the local newspaper in her arms, bent over to pick up this box. That was the last thing Mrs. Sheets ever did. This is the injury pattern to her. Notice the massive damage to the left chest. The left arm is very heavily damaged. Also damage to the abdomen in that area. Other than that, very minor injuries. She doesn't need any other injuries. So that helps us locate the device, doesn't it? She actually managed to pick the device up and straighten up with it before it triggered. This is her x-ray. These are fragments of pipe. You notice there are no fragments of nail in this instant, but we do have fragments of wire scattered throughout the thing. This is a C-cell battery. And that, embedded in her, was of course part of the critical evidence in reconstructing what these devices looked like. These were October 1985. This is, unfortunately, the device itself, I've never had a chance to look at. This was a reconstruction of the device that the investigators produced in Salt Lake City as part of their investigative aids. And the layers of concrete nails are taped to the outside of the device. There are plastic battery holders that have the C-cell batteries in them, 2-inch pipe, approximately 12 inches long, with drilled end caps. This reconstruction was based on information that I telephoned back to the investigator at the scene as I sorted through the evidence at Treasure Island. The next day, Salt Lake City is a very peaceful town, isn't it? Sure it is. The next day, downtown Salt Lake City, around the corner from the Mormon church headquarters, this car blew up. The individual who was in the process of getting in the car at the moment didn't have the door closed. In fact, still had one foot out on the ground. He was blown back out of the car, and we'll see him in a moment. The car was engulfed in fire as a result of the incident and the explosion, and was completely gutted from the firewall all the way to the back of the car. As will happen in this sort of instance, the firefighters come and, protecting property, drown the thing. So whatever didn't get burned up in the fire got washed down the city sewer system. We did make an attempt to open the city sewers and some of the traps and recover some of the bits and pieces, but a lot of the critical evidence was lost. This is a good example, however, of scene security. This happened the day after the previous two incidents. The public authorities, of course, were extremely sensitive about any further developments in this case. As soon as this happened, you notice the security tape across here, and they secured the area, froze all the vehicles present in the area, including the mail truck right there. Here's two investigators from ATF, a local investigator, considering how they're going to search this scene. The vehicle was here when the device went off. It rolled forward as it burned and ended up against this vehicle. It was important that everything be frozen. You're dealing with items, critical items, that can go 500 yards, 1,000 yards downrange from the end directions of a pipe bomb. So anything that's there has to stay there until it's specifically searched. That's why the vehicles are frozen in place. If somebody could easily say, well, my vehicle wasn't damaged, there isn't anything wrong with me, and drive off with a critical piece of evidence lodged in a window or in a tire or something like that. So security of the scene is absolutely vital. It was very well handled in this case. What about the individual who was in the car? His name is Mark Hoffman. He survived. This is the damage that he had to his right hand. He lost the tips of a couple of fingers and a couple of minor scalp lacerations. The major damage to him was a massive injury to his right knee. For some reason, when the police tried to question him in the hospital, he was very nervous about talking to them. He offered contrary statements about what he was doing, and he was really confused. But whatever happened, he didn't want surgery. They seized the x-ray of his leg that was taken as part of the emergency procedure. And guess what showed up in the x-ray? This was visible in profile. In fact, you could see the outline of the semicircular remains of the drilled hole. This is the end cap, or a portion of the end cap. From the end cap alone, you can establish a number of things. The diameter of the device. This is the remnant of the casting mark, the logo of the manufacturer. We can establish the manufacturer from the location and size of this depression here. The location of the drilled hole, the size of the drilled hole, gives us an indication as to what kind of fusing or triggering mechanism was used. And so all of this information was vital, and he didn't want this removed. Well, they managed to convince a judge that yes, this would be a good idea to recover this evidence, and we were able to recover this. Now, unfortunately, it stayed in him for about 24 hours, which meant the tests for explosive residue were compromised, shall we say. Remember that everything that was in the car got burned up. Everything that was outside the car got flushed down the sewer. The only piece of evidence that we had for a long time from the device that wasn't damaged by either exposure was this. So far, managed to identify common components between all of them, the batteries, the pipe caps, the wires, and so on. What I was looking for was proof that the same explosive had been used. And I was stuck. Well, it took me about 2 weeks. That's what happens when you work 16 hours a day for too long. Finally, I remembered that I had his clothes. They weren't either burned up or flushed down the sewer, but they sure as heck were there when the bomb went off. And looking at the powder burns and on the cuffs, needless to say, I had lots of unexploded powder to look at. It was no problem now to figure out it was the same kind of explosive as used in the previous two incidents. But the interesting thing was, it quickly showed up, was based on the powder burns here, on his shirt, on the chest of his shirt, and most critically on his pants. We sorted the pants out. Now typically from emergency room operations, you're all familiar with the thing. You know, you take a pair of scissors and you cut through all of the damage. You cut through the bullet holes, you cut through the knife holes, as many of the blood stains as possible. You rip the garments off and you throw them in the corner. Most of that happened. You can see I made some attempt to repair the damage by stapling the legs of the trousers back together. This is his belt. There's the pocket. This is the fly here. What I'm interested in is, of course, this is a powder pattern. This is a powder pattern. But look at this. There's no powder in that neat little crease there. What does that mean? He had that leg creased. He was in the process of getting in the car, and everything else pointed to the fact that he had the device in his hands, almost in his lap when it went off. That didn't tally with any of the stories he had told the police, and that was the first chink in the armor of his very elaborately 5-year plan, elaborately planned 5-year system to defraud the Mormon Church of millions of dollars for fraudulent documents. And you go, documents? How does this all come back to documents? As it turned out, of course, latent fingerprint, ink comparison, and the document examiners played a critical role in reconstructing the rest of this elaborate net. And of course, time doesn't allow me to go into that. But suffice it to say that Mr. Hoffman was in the process of selling fraudulent historical documents. He found out that the Mormon Church was very interested in historical documents. They were particularly interested if they were documents that went contrary to church history and church feelings. They would pay whatever price he asked. And then they would bury them as deep as possible in the archives so that no one would ever see them again. Steve Christensen happened to be an amateur historian. He started coming across these documents. He was approached by officers of the church saying, well, what about these? What about these? He said, boy, those don't fit. Where did these come from? So he was the first target when things started to go sideways, and Mr. Hoffman decided he better erase his tracks and get out of town. Things were about to fall down around him because people were asking questions about these fortuitous documents. So he hit Christensen, and he figured he better cover his tracks by making it look like it was Christensen's failed financial schemes that had brought him to this, frustrated investor, so he went after Gary Sheets. He missed Gary Sheets, got Kathy Sheets instead. And apparently, this third time, he was on his way to blow up a senior church official in the Mormon church itself, and got himself instead. He didn't miss by much. You can't really see it. There's a hole about 8 inches in diameter in the door of the driver's door, and look at the hole that was immediately above his head in this little tiny car. I get real nervous every time I see Toyota MR2s now. I go, boy, you know what those look like when they're blown up now? It didn't miss by much. And somewhere, I can imagine, on October 16th, morning of October 16th, the great cosmic voice rumbled across Salt Lake City going, damn, I missed. But that was an interesting case because it brings all of the elements of crime investigation together, right down to reconstruction of trajectories and locations and times and people and everything, and trace evidence to boot. So anything you ever wanted to do in criminal investigation, like I said, get into bonding cases, they're great. This is May 1986, Albuquerque, New Mexico. This used to be a kind of an amusement arcade and hobby shop and fix-it shop and things like that. It suddenly went away one night, or at least a portion of it did. The remains of it caught fire and burned pretty substantially. This is an aerial view. Now notice the structural damage here. This was a non-reinforced concrete block wall along this way. You can see part of it is just fell out intact here. This area is in little pieces. These areas in little pieces, and the rest of this suffered largely fire damage. There was a row of overhead steel garage door type openings along here, and they are blown about 200 yards in the far direction. We had pieces of this building as much as 300 yards from ground zero, which is right here. We also had pieces of a victim or two that was the actual major interest, and the New Mexico state authorities, the medical examiner's office did a magnificent job, and in cooperation with ATF, managed to document all of the remains of the individual that was present, and subsequently, within 24 hours, essentially established that we did in fact only have one victim and not two. But we really couldn't tell very much. This is the other view of the parking lot here. There were pieces of victim across here. I found his lower jaw under the trunk of this car, and there were pieces of him a little further out. There were pieces, he was kind of scattered in about 6 different directions. We figured from a 155-pound guy, we recovered about 82 pounds of him. And in fact, this is one of the larger pieces. We think that's a lung right there, that little brown mess. So we had the additional difficulty of not only documenting explosive damage, trying to recover pieces of whatever it was that blew up, but we had the remains, the pathologist and the anthropologist had the concern with the remains. And we were able to, as I said, recover a significant portion of them, allow an identification, as well as a reconstruction. The reconstruction of his remains were as important as the reconstruction of the physical remains. Once again, security was important. The Albuquerque authorities asked for a national response team call out. That involves usually a wait of 24 hours. ATF agents on the scene, experienced in bombing investigations, assisted the New Mexico authorities in recovery of the larger body parts. So many of those had been recovered. Work was already on the way by the time we arrived the next day. As with any explosion and fire scene, you have a variety of possible excuses or reasons why this suddenly went away. So it's just like any other fire explosion scene. You start eliminating accidental causes. What could it have been? A heater, a room heater that had leaked and filled the place up with propane, and suddenly something went wrong and blew up. Well, that's a possibility. In this particular case, you can't see in this photograph, but this heater isn't connected to anything. So it's pretty unlikely we could blame it on that. As I said, it was a fix-it shop. So we had things, we had solvents, we had charcoal starter, we had cleaning solvents, we had cans of what were labeled thinners and things like that in other parts of the building. We had to search each of those areas out, document what was there, and make sure and eliminate those as potentially contributing to an explosive situation. One of the major complications was hidden in one of the bathrooms. We'll use the term generously. As you can see, it wasn't much of a bathroom, and actually it wasn't much of a meth lab either, which is what this plumbing was to. It would have been very easy at this point to say, ha, right, he was cooking meth, he blew himself up, sorry, tough luck, close the door and go home. Well, that would have been convenient, nobody probably would have worried too much, but none of this was plumbed to anything. We did eventually find a couple of cases of material that had the rest of his modest equipment in it. No raw materials, no stash of chemicals or precursors or anything like that. This apparently was his winter source of income. During the summer, prior to 4th of July, he was in the habit of making M80 explosives. And we were slowly coming to the point of saying, well, there was some sort of condensed phase explosion that happened. Because as we got down through the layers of debris, what showed up but a crater? You don't get a crater from a diffuse phase explosion like vapor or gas explosions. You get that from something solid blowing up. And in fact, this is what the scene looked like after we cleaned off the main part of the concrete slab. And here is our crater here. Associated with the crater, of course, we had a number of items that we had to document, and here is typical NRT responsive. This is the cause and origin specialist. That's the chemist. We have a photographer here who's photographing the burn pattern under this table. The evidence technician is here waiting for permission to recover some stuff that we found under the table, and the crime scene note taker is here keeping track of the photographs. And these two people, the evidence technician and the sketch artist, are an important part of this team. They are just as important as somebody who's in the hole for the duration of the search. As the search extended, we eventually found a storage facility at another location where the precursors and some of the raw materials and stuff for his summer source of income had been secured. And what had happened, unfortunately, well, here's of course the easy out. At this point, you can say, well, right, we found an illegal drug lab. Too bad. We went in and we could go home. But we decided to stick with it. This was a photograph that was actually sent out the day we finished the examination. What we finally recovered were the remains of two buckets, one steel one, one plastic one, covered with a residue of potassium perchlorate, sulfur, and aluminum powder. That's called flash powder. Some people would say that's just fireworks. This guy was in the process, and we found all of his raw materials. Unfortunately, I don't have time to show them all to you. All the paper tubes, the loading rams, the end plugs, the glue, the fuses, the fuse cutter, all of the paraphernalia. The one thing he didn't have was when he finished the product. And what he had been doing was he had everything ready. He was making up his batch of filler. This material, while some people just call it fireworks, is under federal law, an explosive material. The completed M80 device is considered an explosive device because even as a single unit, it can do serious injury or damage. This individual didn't have one. He was in the process of filling two 500-unit trays. He was working with approximately 5 pounds of this material. He was transferring it. He'd been finished mixing it. He was transferring it from a plastic bucket to a metal bucket on a warm, dry mountain night. Guess what happens when you transfer powdery materials like that? You get static buildup. He grounded it. It went snap, and it went boom very shortly thereafter. Flash powders like this truly can detonate. It's an interesting phase of explosive chemistry, but they do go through a true detonation phase, and they render extreme pressures extremely quickly. And as in this case, as remember, I said that the trajectory of the body parts of the victim were equally important. His trunk, his lower torso was found essentially behind the building, blown through the concrete wall. His left arm was found in one corner of the opposite side of the room. His right arm was over there. His head had gone straight out the door and was scattered in pieces for about 100 yards. And what had happened? He was leaning over the bucket. mixing it when it triggered. So that was a tragic accident. You might say, a well-timed accident, considering what he was involved in. But this could have gone any one of a number of ways. He was involved in drug trafficking. Maybe somebody was icing because of the drug traffic. Maybe he's building an explosive device to do somebody else in. But all of the circumstances, all the reconstruction came back down to a tragic accident. Let's take a brief moment and visit the laboratory and see what kind of stuff happens in the laboratory. These are the spacious confines of the Treasury Department laboratory at Treasurana. They waited until I left before they got a new laboratory. So in March, they'll be in the John DeHaan Memorial Laboratory. And this is what evidence from a bombing might look like. And here we have pieces of the container and photographs of the scene, cans of debris from the scene, and so on. And this represents kind of a typical case. You notice that the first step is to lay it all out and sort it. This is largely a visual sport, and if all of your evidence is in Ziploc bags or some other sort of transparent container, that helps a lot. Because if you have to spend the first 3 hours of the case sorting all of this stuff out, each one of which has been triple stapled in paper bags, you're really not in a good mental frame of mind to deal with the intellectual processes required. And all you really want to do is shovel it back into the box and put it back in the evidence vault. But what has to happen is every piece has to come back out. And in this case, in fact, what I was doing was taking it out of the paper bags and repackaging it in Ziploc bags so that I could sort it visually. And that's the first step, is sort it to see what you've got. Clock parts. Now remember, this stuff doesn't look like it was sent from the factory anymore. It looks rather badly abused for the most part, and some of it is still identifiable. The pieces on the right were in fact pieces of the same kind of clock as on the left, including the case and the face and things like that, and that's useful information intelligence to send back to your investigators. One of the only reasons this works, though, is that this laboratory does so many bombing cases that they have invested the time in a comprehensive set of control samples. Now, these aren't control samples like you'll see anywhere else. We have clocks, batteries, wires, blasting caps, light bulbs, all sorts of strange things that most other laboratories wouldn't invest the time in. And yet it's very important to be able to quickly sort through this stuff and figure out what the device looked like, because time is of the essence. The Salt Lake City case, we were phoning results back within 24 hours of the arrival of the exhibits in the laboratory, telling them what kind of pipe, what kind of batteries, how many batteries, what kind of wire, what kind of detonator, everything. And as I said, the evidence doesn't really look all that swell when it comes in. And if you find something like this at the scene, it may not look like the mainspring of a clock anymore. So you have to watch out for that kind of damage. These pieces, I'd never seen the inside of a 9-volt battery before until I encountered this in debris and found out that one manufacturer of batteries, 9-volt batteries, uses these little paper and foil contact strips inside the metal casing. And it has a series of 6 vertical little cells inside. And that's, in fact, what these fragments represented. So we were able to tell the investigator very quickly what kind of battery was recovered. Now, the components themselves, of course, come a large percentage of the time from Radio Shack, as it's known in the trade, the bomber's friend. You can buy almost everything you need at Radio Shack. What you can't get, you can get at Orchard Supply Hardware down the street. So within 2 or 3 stores, for $15, you can establish a hell of a weapon that can kill numerous people, intimidate whole neighborhoods. It's a great sport. And that is, in fact, what we're seeing almost exclusively in criminal bombings today. We're not dealing with large caches of high explosives. Judy Suchy's case to the contrary. And that was pretty exceptional. That's really going for me. You go through 8 tons of military high explosives. That's good. We are seeing pipe bombs, black powder filled, smokeless powder filled, helped with shrapnel, to extreme damage. Very cheap to build, very easy to build. It isn't the kind of technology that you have to be a rocket scientist to have on hand, and people are using it. As I said, ATF did over 600 bombing and explosives-related cases in 1987. This is the kind of stuff you have to get used to looking for, though. This looks like a little charred piece of cotton cord. It's not cotton cord. It's blasting fuse, time fuse. And in order to recognize that as important evidence, you have to have seen it used at least once. These are smaller segments of it that have been through various explosions. The next step is to do microscopic analysis. In some cases, high magnification. In most cases, we're doing low magnification stereo microscope exams. Identifying unburned fragments of the powder. That's what was essentially so essential to the Hoffman case. Identifying the right kind of powder and making sure that that was the same powder used in all three devices. Not very high-tech, but it works pretty well. Also not very high-tech, something that works pretty well most of the time for organic explosives is simple thin layer chromatography. And 10 microgram type sensitivity. This is nitroglycerin, nitrocellulose separation, quick and dirty and fairly specific. On a more elaborate scale, of course, you can confirm by high pressure liquid chromatography coupled to, or gas chromatography coupled to thermal analysis type detector. And once again, for a large instrument like this, very specialized, you're only going to find it in laboratories that do this kind of work a lot. Ion chromatography is used as our spot test and microcrystal test to confirm the inorganic explosives, which of course are very common not only to the high explosives, and of course elemental analysis by emission spec or X-ray fluorescence, and finally infrared. Because we don't want to just identify the major explosive, we want to be able to identify all of the components. What the main explosive was, how it was contained, how it was concealed, how it was connected, how the timer was set up. Was it set up as a trigger, a delay, anti-disturbance? All of those are important elements, and that's what constitutes the report that we send on to the investigators. So it isn't just a matter of mixing some chemicals in the laboratory and hoping for the best. It's crime scene investigation and reconstruction at its most complex and its most challenging. Thank you for the opportunity to tell you about it. This is a first. This is the first time I've ever finished early. Dwayne.
John, in reading an account of your first case in Salt Lake City, I read it and I found the story most unsatisfactory and the rough ending it had for the acceptance of the plea after this well-developed investigation. Do you know the reason that took place? Or can you...
It's my understanding from the circumstances. Now remember, I grew up in Chicago, so I tend to be very suspicious of any sort of organized system of any kind. And the members of the Mormon Church, higher echelon, were very unhappy that they had been taken as badly as they had, even by Hoffman's masquerading, if you will, as a true and devout Mormon. And he had been a member of the church. He was wearing the garments. He was really one of their gung-ho members. And they feel that they really took him in. Rather than risk the embarrassment of a public trial, there was a considerable amount of pressure to accept a double plea, one on the homicide charges and one on 2 counts of fraud. They, however, retained the right to prosecute at a later time 30 additional counts of fraud that they have against Mr. Hoffman, should he survive, if you will, his term of incarceration in the prison. I noticed a couple of weeks ago that apparently they decided not to wait until he got out of prison because he was taken to the prison hospital 2 weeks ago in critical condition for an overdose of tranquilizers. And apparently somebody was salting his food. So they apparently aren't going to wait for him to get out. Take him for a long ride on the Great Salt Lake. Or a short ride. Swimming lessons in the Great Salt Lake. And that's, unfortunately, that falls with my suspicions, but that's completely aside from the investigative standpoint. Yes, Mary.
It looked like the MR2 headlamps were on.
They were up.
They probably were. Or I've never driven one of the cars. They stay up even though you turn the lights off, right? I mean, they aren't like some cars when you
My
shut
Pulsar does. You flip them up without the lights being on.
Yeah, he was in the habit apparently of driving with the lights up and had driven in early that day. So he had probably driven in while it was still dark or early dawn and was in the process of cruising the area looking for his target. And what he did was he had been seen in the vicinity of the Sheets residence. He had been seen in the vicinity of in fact, he had been seen on the floor of Christensen's office. And what he would do the device was in a paper-wrapped parcel with one corner loose and the two wires protruding. He would case the place, he would make sure it was safe to locate his device, and he would twist the last two connections together, stuff it down into the box, and place the device. Man of steel nerves. And he finally failed him. He did it, he got away with it twice. The third time, apparently, he was in the process of casing his victim. He had located his target and something upset him. It wasn't safe to leave the device. So he retreated with the device still in his hands and made it all the way to his car. And that'll teach him to buy a small car, right? He couldn't get in, and apparently he hit the gear shift with the box, or he hit the console with the box, and it fell over as he was getting in the car. The fact that he hadn't gotten completely in the car undoubtedly saved his life, because the concussive effects alone should have killed him. But he was still halfway in the car, pants leg crease. He was still in the process of bringing his left leg in the car when the device triggered.
Did you say what sort of explosive he actually used in Part 1 and Part 2, or other materials found in his residence when they ultimately searched it?
The three devices all contained the same sort of double-base smokeless powder, with a blasting cap. Double-base smokeless powder, in this case, contained, I think, approximately 30% nitroglycerin. When triggered with a blasting cap, you have about a 60% chance of getting a high-order detonation. And that's essentially what he produced in the two devices that triggered on his two targets. The one that could have taken him out didn't trigger that successfully. So he had lots of explosive potential. He had 4 pounds of high explosive essentially in each device. The interesting thing was that, to tell you and show you how elaborate the case was, he had examined a fully furnished house outside Salt Lake City that had a complete workshop. He borrowed the key to that house from the real estate agent and watched while the real estate agent, while he was showing him the house the day before, tapped in the security code. He went to the house, the rental house. He was seen in the area the day before the incidents, gone to the rental house, or the house for sale, used that workshop, cleaned up after himself, dropped the tools in a river somewhere. When they searched his residence, he had all brand new tools. Isn't that amazing? You don't do much around the house, do you, Mr. Hoffman? They're still all in plastic and wrappers and stuff like that. And all brand new tools. There was nothing to link him with the devices, other than what started to fall apart when the alibi didn't wash. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
How big was the mercury switches? Because it would seem that just any slight tilting of the box would put it on.
Well, that's certainly the way it worked for Christensen. That's right. It was the size of about the size of a pencil eraser, quarter of an inch in diameter. One of them was a two-prong device, and one of them was the three-prong device. We never did find the device in the vehicle. That apparently got washed down the sewer. But no, they aren't very big, and they're sold in every Radio Shack store. The interesting thing was, of course, the nice thing about Radio Shack is they're very cooperative with law enforcement. They will go through all kinds of efforts to retrieve their sales records. They found the sales record for the materials used in these devices, but it was made out to a false name with a false address. that finally kicked back on Mr. Hoffman when that name and that address showed up in the documents of one of his false identities. He had 3 or 4 false identities around the area, and that was one of them. So,
what's your estimation on the amount of material recovered from a bomb after it's exploded? What would you say you recovered to reconstruct the device?
In those devices?
Well, not you, but I mean the agencies that are submitting those things to you. I know you.
Anywhere from 1% to 80% of the device can come in.
And now for the NRT.
For the NRT, it's almost the same odds because the NRT usually gets the worst of all the cases and things like that. The biggest nasty ones. The only pieces we had of biography, for instance, were the 2 buckets, the remains of the 2 buckets. One final cautionary note: as you notice, the evidence from Hoffman, and I dismissed it kind of lightly, saying that the emergency room people tried to discard it. It's very important for any of you dealing with living victims. Don't forget the only things that we had from that case were on a living victim. So just assume don't assume that he has to show up in a slab before you save his clothes. If you have victims associated with a bombing, even a potential bombing, have an officer go with the injured and recover the clothing. And make sure they're there when they do emergency treatment and recover any fragments of the device or whatever, anything that doesn't belong to the victim, make sure it comes back with the officer, because that may be the only evidence that survives. Well, to keep you on schedule, I'll call it off. I'll be here tonight and be glad to talk to you further. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And our last speaker, but not our most, certainly the least. I'll give it that. Our own Jerry.
Thank you. I'm supposed to speak on reconstruction and also on the role of the criminalist at the crime scene. We've heard the role of the anthropologist, the pathologist, the explosives expert, and that impressed me. I was very impressed. I wouldn't want to put one of those jigsaw puzzles back together. That's difficult. Got a new admiration for you, John. What is the role of the criminalist at the crime scene? Most people relegate them to collecting, preserving the evidence, the documentation, or at least that's what they seem to think that the criminalist is designed for. That is not what a criminalist can do at the crime scene, and today I hope to show you some of the things that we can do in the reconstruction of what happened. I've talked to homicide detectives who say, hey, I do my own reconstruction. If my people can't do it, then nobody can do it. Well, the criminalist is trained in science. He has a different way of looking at things than does the investigator. Yet, there is an overlap, and the criminalist should be in communications constantly with the investigator, and the investigator with the criminalist, and with the pathologist and the prosecutor and everybody else involved in the case. The criminalist also needs to get into some of the background of what goes on in the investigator's mind. You do that by studying some of the things that constitute the backdrop against which our expertise is employed, if I may quote Dr. Hind, yesterday's counter speech. We need to study what goes on in serial homicides. What is the makeup of those people? How do we recognize a serial homicide? What is a cult killing? What is the criminal profiling all about? Those things all go up into the investigator's background, and the criminal should also get involved in those so that you can understand those and know when to apply the things that he knows and be able to recognize some of the things that are out at the crime scene. He had one criminalist that was a very good laboratory criminalist and went through our CERT training at the Department of Justice. This is 6 weeks of training with an investigator and very intensive high crime scene work and other background work. Before this class, or before this training, he would not go to crime scenes. He didn't like crime scenes. People didn't want him at crime scenes. After he took that training, he now is being requested to go to all of the crime scenes. So I think there is something to be said for learning what is wanted out there, and it's a fault of us criminals as well as of the just not communicating with the investigators and not really caring whether we communicate. As was said at the Oklahoma first conference on serial murders, the problem with law enforcement today is the lack of communications and apathy. Those are the two main problems. I turned to the guy next to me and I said, "Did you hear that?" He said, "What?" I said, "The two problems with law enforcement today, the two big problems." He says, "Yeah, nah, I didn't hear it." I said, "You know what they are?" He said, "No, I don't know. And frankly, I don't give a damn." Well, when we talk reconstruction, we're not talking of recreation, putting things back together in the same manner. When I talk of reconstruction, I'm talking about putting back together the events of how the crime happened. What happened out there? How does that differ from the recreation of the crime scene, which is done with the photos, the diagrams, the notes, the videotapes, everything else that you can collect about the crime scene, put it together to look at it. Then you can take a view of the entire crime scene and try and make some decisions about what occurred. My partner and I have put together a series of different ways of looking at the evidence. If you look at blood spatters, you're looking at one type of reconstruction. I know a lot of people have gone to the blood spatter class. They look at it and they can say, well, this happened and this happened. Sometimes you get all of that. Sometimes it helps with the crime scene. Sometimes it is misleading because you overlooked things. You're looking at the wrong things. Luke gave us a very good background in firearms this morning. Again, you can look at ricochets, you can look at the straight line effect of a gunshot, and you can do some reconstruction. But you've got to put that together with the other things that occur at the crime scene and put all of them together so that you make sense out of the events that occurred. We decided that if we went through and tried to classify all the types of evidence that you could use in reconstruction, you would go through everything that you do in a forensic science book and say each one of these things can be used. That's not really the way that it's used, though. We decided to look at it in a different way. You have to realize that the evidence is going to be have a relation to its surroundings and to time. In the fourth dimension, I should say. It undergoes predictable changes. So we classify one thing as predictable changes, unpredictable changes, transient evidence, relational evidence, and functional evidence. Predictable changes are such things as the temperature of a body going down, which Dr. Rivers mentioned earlier this morning, or this afternoon. That is a predictable change if you know the rest of the things around the body. However, it's not the only thing that you have to look at. We had a case where a pathologist came into the crime scene. He had turned the woman over to insert a thermometer into her rectum. Had pulled her pants down too. She was laying on bed. I asked why had he done this. He said to get the time of death. Well, that was the day it snowed in Stockton. Believe it or not, it snowed in Stockton. And this woman had gone out to take photographs of the snow when her daughter called her to come pick her up at school. She had not shown up in 20 minutes, so the daughter called again. She didn't answer. She waited another 5 minutes, but she only lived a couple blocks. But she didn't want to walk in the snow. Believe me, in Stockton, that's unusual stuff. Anyway, she called again, and no answer, so she called her neighbor. The neighbor went over there. We had a total of 30-minute time period. And it took some time to get from the kitchen into the bedroom, and then for the other actions to take place. So we had the time of death down within 10 minutes. We knew when she had died. But of course, the rectal temperature, that'll give you plus or minus 2 hours, right, honey? That's predictable changes. Unpredictable changes, things that happen over which you have no control, or almost no control. Most devastating are those which change the patterns that you use for reconstruction. One of the most devastating ones you can come up with is the body bag. The clothing that the victim has on has patterns on it. You take the body and you put it in a body bag and you slosh it around and you carry it in and put it on the morgue. Maybe you even turn it over so that you don't put that poor person on their face, because they're laying on their face in the first place. You roll them on their back, put them in the body bag, haul them off to the morgue. Now you send the clothes in and ask the criminals to look at them, tell you what happened at the crime scene. Can't be done. I'll show you some examples of that when we get to the slides. Transient evidence, the odors, things like that are not going to remain behind at the crime scene. Best person to notice that is the first officer at the crime scene. He walks into the crime scene, he notices something, he gets a gut reaction. Don't let that person get away without talking to him. Some departments send that person back out on patrol and lose him. But that person has an impression. Maybe it's something he smelled, something he got an impression of that is unusual. The smoldering cigarette butt, anything like that, that he would see that nobody else will ever see. Relational evidence, that which has meaning by virtue of its location with respect to the position of other items. Position of the cartridge casings combined with the position of the bullet holes or the direction of flight of the bullets gives you a fix on where the shooter was. Not an exact position, but a close one. The piece of glass from a broken window at a murder scene that is on top of blood would indicate that the glass was broken after the homicide, indicating that this was not a true homicide by a burglar, but was a homicide by the husband. In a particular case it was anyway. The functional evidence refers to the operational condition of an item. Safety on a gun. Some of the things that Luke mentioned this morning. The magazine. What's the position of the hammer? What's the position of the little lever on the bottom of the shotgun? All of these things, if you touch the shotgun, unload it, move it, you've lost it. These things have to be recorded and documented right at the crime scene, and they are functional evidence. If you change them, you've lost them. There's one other classification of evidence that's missing. Things that aren't there, that should have been there, that were taken by the suspect or moved by the suspect to another location. Those are missing things. Those are important in reconstruction as well. The questions that you address when you attempt a reconstruction are broken out again into a group of subjects. Sequencing, establishing directions, describing the actions, defining locations, identifying ownership or origin, and limiting the scene. Sequencing evidence is anything that can aid in establishing the order of the events in a crime. Multiple bullet holes through a glass window to determine which shot was first, into the body to determine which shot was first. Some of the things that Luke gave us this morning about the one with the rust out of the barrel of the gun was sequencing evidence to give the two shots. Directional evidence gives you the action, which way were things going, where did they come from? The things John talked about the explosives, where did it originate from? That's directional evidence. Action evidence are those things that show the motion or actions of the participants. These streaks on the wall of blood that show the number of blows delivered in a beating. Those are action evidence items. Position is established not only by the location of the evidence, but by the orientation of the evidence. A footprint or fingerprint inside the window of a glass, inside a car, would normally be thought of to put the person in the car. But the hitchhiker that was on Highway 101 and was seen looking in the window of the car, or seen being stopped by the car in which a dead body was found later, his fingerprint was inside. But fortunately, the officer who lifted the fingerprint marked the orientation of the fingerprint, because the guy said, I looked in the window, I reached over the half-open window, put my hand inside like this, and said, are you going to Eureka? He said, no, I'm turning. And so I didn't get in the car. The fingerprint was pointed down instead of up. he had been in the car, pushing this way against the window, his fingerprint would have meant that he was inside. Here it meant that he did tell the truth, and we did not have the right suspect. Ownership or origin is usually established by the laboratory procedure. Whose blood is it? Whose hair is it? Whose fingerprint? All of these are questions that laboratory analysis takes care of. Evidence which defines a scene or limits a scene is the limiting evidence. Some of these items are not necessarily thought of as evidence themselves or limits. The walls, but yet the wall can have a hole in it, the bullet goes into the next room, then the wall of the next room is the limit of the scene. You continue to expand the scene or be ready to expand the scene, you have to include all the items of evidence in the crime scene. And one of the things John said is you can tiptoe around and dance around in a crime scene with a lot of blood in it without doing damage. I don't really agree, John. You can't go to any crime scene without changing it. The moment you walk in that scene, you've changed it. And even if it's just breathing the air, you've changed it. So there's never a crime scene that will be ideal to look at. I saw the closest I've seen to a crime scene that was pristine. It was one that was done by New Zealand, where they took a cherry picker to go out and lift the body up. Then they built a ramp over this field and actually worked the footprints in the sand in an area about the size of the stage area up here from this ramp. And they never touched the soil. And of course they put a tent over it so that there was nothing to change the crime scene. The only problem they had was that the insects kept coming up from the bottom. It took them 8 days though, too. If you have that kind of time and facilities, it's great. Finally, you have to listen to the stories. You listen to the story that every person tells in a case. The story of the witnesses, the victims, the suspect, and the officer's theories as to what happened. And you, as Brian Parker said, you work to destroy them. Everything you do in the lab does not prove something happened. It proves it couldn't happen by something else. You don't prove that that's that person's blood, but you can prove it isn't his. You can continue to work at trying to destroy these stories when you can't destroy it. Or if you quote Sherlock Holmes, eliminating the impossible until whatever is left, however improbable, is the truth. That is how we would work at a crime scene, eliminating the impossible. Taking these stories, eliminating them, destroying them, continue until you have only one thing left. That has to be the truth. I have a case that that illustrates the listening to the stories. Elmer and Edna, we'll call them, were out having a few drinks one night. They left the bar and went home, arguing as usual. 30 minutes later, Elmer calls the sheriff's office and said, "I just shot Edna." The police show up and there's Edna lying on the bed. Her shoes have been removed as if she was getting ready for bed. Her feet are towards the pillow end of the bed on her side, which is rather narrow, close to the wall with the dresser down at the foot of the bed. She has a hole that they can see readily right in the center of her chest, and there's some powder around it. When they remove that, now they find, and she's laying on her hands, with her hands in the middle of her back, holding the back. When they remove her, they found 2 more holes, one under her right arm and one in her back. One shot appeared to be this one from about 18 inches, this one from about 12 inches, and the one in the back about 6 inches. He said he admitted that he didn't do it just completely accidentally, that he had been going to commit suicide because she was berating him because he is impotent. So he had taken the gun to shoot himself. She had grabbed it, and it had gone off, shooting her 3 times. Well, the bed was queen size. You could only approach it from this side. You couldn't reach and get the distances across the bed without getting on the bed itself from the opposite side. The only way you could approach it and then to get close enough to her, because shots in her was from the side over here. Yet the cartridge casings were all at the foot of the bed, the wrong direction. They went to the left. They did not go to the right. I've set this scene up 100 times at least for police officers and criminalists and attorneys in a crime scene reconstruction class. Invariably, they all say, he's lying. No way could he have shot her 3 times that way. And they come up with some tale about how he crawled across the bed and did it. Yet, you hand those same people the gun, the .22 rifle, and say, okay, shoot yourself. They turn it around, put their thumb in the trigger. Now which way does it eject? It ejects to the left. Those cartridge cases went in the same position, just as if he had been going to shoot himself, and she grabbed the gun. Took a look at the sleeve underneath the shirt that she had on, this long sleeve shirt. There was powder on the sleeve. She did have her arm out towards the gun. Nobody had bothered to dust the end of the gun to see if she had fingerprints on it. Couldn't prove it. I can't prove that that's actually what happened, but there was certainly a large doubt in my mind. I wouldn't testify in the case any other way. And one other thing, as far as forming an intent to kill her in this case, she had a .32 BA. Somebody thought about 6 hours later to get his blood alcohol. He was a .26. So I don't think he formed an intent to kill his wife. Show some slides on some of the cases that show some of the points that I've tried to cover. Is that on?